Okay, it's time to get started. Week 2 is past, so this is sort of a catch-up lecture brought to you from the original COVID cavern where I started doing these lectures. You may notice the channel has hundreds of these things. It is the same class every semester, but things change. I did this online lecture in 2020, in April 2020 because of COVID. Let me say the production values are low. I have no assistance, it's just me doing this. You might notice there's an angle to the whiteboard because there's a light reflecting off the corner, which I can't really fix. Lighting in here is not ideal, but I have a small air conditioner in here so I can manage even though it's still super hot. This is the hottest Chuseok on record. So brought to you from the COVID cavern. This is my nickname for it. But seriously, we don't need to talk about the production values of the class. We just need to focus on the material. So let's say this lecture is brought to you by Nike. Just do it. Just kidding. No sponsors. Okay. So we talked about the first millennium. We've done the introduction to the class. So our goal today is to get through the rest of chapter 1. The mock quiz, which we will do next week. Today is actually Chuseok. This will be uploaded on Wednesday, and then there'll be a second one that quickly follows it as I catch up on making videos for the holidays tomorrow. So week 3 will be up shortly. This is based on chapter 1, so I'll actually add this here just so you can keep it in mind that we are focusing on chapter 1 here. Certain things on the board are not in the textbook. So you've got the textbook, you can follow along as we go. This is something I talked about. This is just a reminder that I mentioned this is going to be right in the corner, right in the light, so you don't need to worry about it. But nation, what the difference between a nation, a state, and a kingdom is, keep that in mind. England is going to become all 3 of these things, and the United Kingdom, the state, kingdom, and nation, that won't exist. These 3 words mean slightly different things. You just have to keep in mind that a nation is more of a cultural influence, okay? Now this is not in the textbooks, so I want to explain this because it should be. I've already done 4 additions to this. This is the 4th edition. However, there's a few tags here. These tags indicate places where I need to add a few things. So periodically there's going to be a few things that somehow I've talked about many times. They need to be in the textbook, but they're not. So please make sure you listen carefully to the things with the stars. The differences between these words for talking about countries, as we would call them now, that's not in the textbook either. So you have to pay attention in lecture, and if you have a question, you have to ask me, email me, or ask me in class, so I can tell everybody the answer. So cultural influence really belongs at the end of the chapter, where page 42. From page 40, I told you this is the most important part of the introduction and one of the most important parts of the textbook, period. So from page 38, where I start talking about cultural studies, because despite the fact that it sounds like a history course sometimes, this is a course offered as a culture class. This is British and American culture. And as I said, we're going to be talking about how to understand how British identity is formed first, and then American. Identity is a key thing you have to keep in mind here too. How it changes over time, and how we think it's represented. One way of doing that, it's in the textbook, is to talk about context. Another way to do it is to talk about power dynamics, the cultural dynamics, how dominant one part of a culture is, right? You can take any example you want. You can talk about music, you can talk about military, you can talk about political parties, or you can talk about people. and you can break them down. So this is a little bit different because it's related actually to nations. This idea was introduced to me by a writer who wrote a great book about the nations of America, and he claims that Canada and America are actually 11 nations. So California has its culture, New York has its culture, and they can be broken down geographically. So I also mentioned to you before about the geography of England. Now I'm mentioning America just briefly, but the same applies. There's regions. At the center of those cultures is a core, and we're really talking about a smaller area. We'll say London, for example. Around that area is a domain, and around that area, we'll just make a mess of this here. It looks like a fried egg. The center is the core, and the second area is the domain, and then the sphere. These cultures overlap each other, right? So we were talking about, last class, we were talking about the Jutes and the Saxons and the Angles, the Germanic tribes that make England, and they are overlapping in each other. The core, though, of England is always London, right? It's the capital city. It has a core, and then its influence expands out from there. You have Wales, which is another nation, completely different, Gaelic, Brittonic nation, and then you have Scotland in the north, and there's sort of two nations there too. There's the Highland Scots and there's the Lowland Scots, and they are sort of Glasgow and Edinburgh are in the lowlands, and then it gets rockier and more sparse, colder, and eventually just sort of disintegrates into islands, into the sea. It's breathtakingly beautiful, but living in the highlands is much more difficult. You might compare it to, as you are in South Korea, the farther you go south towards Busan, it's sort of the terrain is still mountainous, but the hills get greener and greener as you get down south until in Jeolla and Gyeongsang in South Korea, there's more farmland. It's much more fertile. The farther you go north in North Korea, the closer you get to Mongolia and Russia in the northern part of Korea, in North Korea. Hamgyongdo, I guess, is the northernmost province. There it's just rockier and more difficult, to grow things because it's colder. There's not good soil for growing, and that's as a consequence, it's less wealthy. It's not always true in the case of South Korea, North Korea, the balance of wealth, but South Korea has a larger population and can feed itself, whereas North Korea can't support 50 million people. Although South Korea does import a lot of food these days too. So these center parts, if you're talking about England, you've got the sort of far west and southwest, where there's a lot of sea-based culture. Cornwall is the sort of corner of that, and they're sort of more related to Welsh people than they are to people from London. And like I said, you've got this area, Kent, which is very close to France, and France's culture is sort of always influencing them. And in the north, you have the famous cities everybody knows in Korea because of soccer, Manchester and Liverpool. In the northwest, near the border of Wales, and then on the other side you have York. So anyway, you don't need to memorize all these cities, just you need to know that regions and areas sort of expand outward, and they have sort of blurred edges to them, but the center parts you can clearly tell where you are. New York has a very different culture than Los Angeles. The closer you are to Los Angeles, the more you can feel it. New York City, if you're in New Jersey, you're not a New Yorker. Don't tell a New Yorker that. But you're definitely influenced heavily by New York culture. It's just very expensive to live in New York, so you might be working in New York and living in New Jersey, for example. Okay, so that's core, domain, and sphere. This is recorded, so you can write this down and you can put it in your book or you can put it in your notebook. And you can also re-watch this once you've done your done your attendance and completed watching the video. You want to stop it at any point you can and make some notes. So these are the cultural things in the introduction. What I said I was going to do mostly today was talk about the famous people that match with the cultures that become dominant one after another. So remember, originally the British Isles are populated by Celtic tribes. They end up being called the Britons eventually. So the Britons, we talked about Boudica already. I explained about her, and I talked to you about Caesar. He was the first Roman that we know of to arrive on the island and start influencing, using his imperial culture from Rome. So he is a Roman who was born in Rome and is sort of more of a core, I guess you would call him a core Roman. And Arthur, he lives hundreds of years later after the Roman sphere of influence has started collapsing, and it really just rolls back to France, and then it rolls back further, back from Spain and Africa, and then it moves east, and the center of Roman influence becomes Byzantium, which will later become it's Constantinople for most of its history, and then it becomes Istanbul. It's the capital of Turkey. If any of you have been there, breathtaking. It still has many of its elements of Greek culture and Roman Greek culture, which we call the Byzantine culture. But of course, it's now Turkish, but it sits right on the bridge between Europe and Asia. So you can see like it's sort of a mixed nation. It's got two cores in it. Over their history, the Byzantium that we know in history, which is very, very Roman, becomes the core Roman city, one of the biggest cities in the world. Its culture is gone. Its civilization is an ancient civilization that no longer exists. It's replaced by Turkey. Okay, so King Arthur, I will have to show you some pictures, some slides of these people just to give you an idea of what people thought of. There's no photographs, there's only mosaics and drawings and paintings and sort of artist renderings of things in books. So there's a lot of images of Arthur. He is a Romano-Briton, so he's supposed to be sort of who knows if he's actually mixed blood or not, maybe. But the point is, he's more ethnically native to the island. He's not born in Rome or in another province. His ancestors, he's descended from the people that start to retake control of the isle. But there is a vacuum. There's a power vacuum when Rome collapses, when its influence just shrinks back, and the empire starts collapsing. Like I said, 410 AD. Around 55 BC is when Caesar goes there and Boudica is there. Actually, Boudica is there. She's resisting after Caesar. However, let's not confuse things too much with the dates, because like I said, this is not a history class. You just have to remember, originally there were Britons, then there were Romans, and then there was a blend, and then these guys, the Anglo-Saxons, they'll eventually blend together too, and these Anglo-Saxons will start to take over. And I said it's more of a blending than a complete takeover or conquering that people used to think. The Vikings will come along, which usually they actually called themselves Danes. And as I said to you before, a lot of Europeans call them Norsemen. And then finally, we're going to have the last Anglo-Saxon king from Alfred's line. He's in the textbook because he's the one who is going to, well, he's not the last Anglo-Saxon king. He's the last of Alfred's line. Alfred's line dies out. So let's talk about Arthur first. Arthur's not a real person. It's just based on sort of a medieval idea that there was a king that tried to stop the German Angles and Saxons and Vikings from swamping the entire island, but he failed. In the story, it's a myth. He is, as a boy, he discovers that he's the chosen one by pulling the sword out of the stone, and his protector is Merlin, the wizard, and I mean Gandalf, or take your pick, Harry Potter, Dumbledore, all these classic old man wizards that live for hundreds of years using strange magic to keep themselves alive. And Merlin gets the sword, from the Lady of the Lake. She comes out of the, she's wearing mithril armor, shiny silver armor, and she comes and she gives him the sword, and then Merlin puts it in his sword so that someday the destined king will come and pull it out of the sword. And that sword's name is Excalibur. A lot of people know that name. We'll talk about Richard the Lionheart, who is a real king who lived in the 12th century. And he was a crusading king. So he was a warrior king who fought in the Middle East, in Palestine, to try and take the Holy Land from Islam, and failed. Like they all did eventually. The Crusades were rolled back, but there were several hundred years where you usually see the Red Cross on a white long tabard, which is worn over the armor, and they were inspired by warrior kings like Arthur. Even though he's not a real person, he was written down in French originally. We'll have to talk about that later, how the kings of England actually spoke French, but Arthur he ends up becoming a blend of all of these people, including the Normans who will come after. So you got to keep these things straight. Britons first, which are Celtic people, Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Danes, and then chapter 2 begins with the Norman conquest, which will change, the culture of England forever. And we have to discuss how their domination of the British Isle changes the way that England sees itself, and eventually how it sees the United Kingdom of Great Britain. Britannia, as I said, was a province, right? Keep that in mind, that the Roman province, when London is the capital of the Roman province of Britain, that's post Caesar, so all the way down to Arthur. Britannia is gone. He's trying to save it, and he was more influenced by Roman culture than people in the gap afterwards. But eventually, that Roman influence will come back. When the British Empire becomes an empire and calls itself the United Kingdom of Great Britain, they're really going back to the Roman stuff and to King Arthur. Okay? So that's why Arthur is so important. Even though he's just a story, he's not a real person. That's one of the facts you gotta keep straight. Is that King Arthur is not a real guy, just there's a legend about him. Now, Alfred is the real thing. And he's actually supposed to be descended from the enemies of Arthur. But, these people are defending themselves. Boudica's defending herself from the Romans. The Romans are defending themselves from the Angles and the Saxons and everybody else. The Britons are, as they merge together, they're resisting each layer. So this is where the cultural dynamics from the introduction becomes useful. Now, like I said, Arthur's and Caesar, we've talked about them both, the key things about both of them. Remember to keep your notes straight for that, because you can't refer to it in the book. But there's quite a bit of stuff here that I wrote about Alfred in chapter 1. So if you go to page 55, on the one side of the page, on the one face of the page, is Boudica's statue. I know I spelled it. I spelled it like this. In the book, I spelled it like this. There's various spellings. Who really knows? I don't even know if I'm saying it correctly. I say Boudica. I think Boedica, or there's a different way of pronouncing it. I'm probably not doing it right. I'm not sure if anybody knows how to speak ancient Brittonic, but if you know how to say it, then you can let me know. So Alfred was a Saxon. he was a West Saxon. Let me make sure this is an O here. Might be unclear. Those of you who are not using English as your first language. I'm an excellent. This is why I have to do these videos so often or so many times, because of false starts and the mistakes. So these are the Saxons, Saxons. The Angle kingdoms, East Anglia, Mercia, Northumbria, they get conquered by the Vikings, by the Danes, and Alfred is the only one left. He's considered sort of the savior of England. He's actually a quite sick individual. He's got some sort of health problem where he gets sick a lot. So he has difficulty, being a good warrior king, although he has talent, and he obviously organizes the army very well. And the Vikings are scary and they're quick. They appear out of nowhere and start destroying stuff. So you have to organize yourself. You have to be ready. You have to have weapons and food ready to fight. And he does that very well. So gradually the Vikings, they go all over Europe. They go all the way to Italy and Sicily. They go to Africa. They go to the Middle East. They go to Syria, and they're part of the Crusaders. The Normans are part of the crusading groups too. They go all the way down there, especially the Normans. The Normans are really not, they're part Viking, they're part French. But they are descendants of people that come from the kingdoms of Denmark. Sweden isn't very developed yet, but eventually the kingdom of Sweden will become more powerful. But in this age, it's the kingdom of Denmark, the Danes, where Canute becomes king later. That's going to be a problem. Most of England and Scotland, most of the United Kingdom, is covered by Viking control, and the laws of the Vikings are followed there. So the bottom half of England is controlled by Alfred and his son and his grandson. Now the big thing that Alfred does is they lose London. And London is not a very important city anymore, but it's still in the right place. It's sort of been falling apart for hundreds of years. By the time Alfred is running around fighting the Vikings and Danes in the end of the 9th century, so we're talking like 800 and almost to 900 AD, when he's trying to defend the kingdom of what's remaining of the Angles and Saxons, everything is under control of the Danish. So he pushes them back to the point where he takes London back, and London is starting to become the center. It starts to become the center of trade, the center of population growth once again. But it's kind of like a dying city for hundreds of years before the Anglo-Saxons restore it, because the Danes are not particularly interested in building huge, road networks and empires the way that their culture is not like the Romans. They're not doing architecture. They bring other things. Basically, they force England to become a country. All these kingdoms, of which there were 7, they all disappear, and then there's only Wessex. And when the Vikings get pushed farther and farther north, until they're pretty much out of Scotland by the time that Edward is there, they consolidate the whole kingdom, and that is when England is born. So Alfred is the father of England in a sense. He starts calling himself, he starts blending the Angle and the Saxon, and then they start calling it the land of the Angles, like I said in class. Okay, so he's a very interesting guy. He's very Christian. In 878, there's a legend there about him. Not all these things are necessarily true. The Small Print, that's taken from Robert Tomb's History of the English. Great book, way too big for most of you. You probably wouldn't want to read it. So I took a piece out of it there. It's quoted. That's from page 13. That's from Lacey Baldwin's English History Made Brief. Robert Toombs also talks about it, but I'm quoting her there. She's a very good storyteller, so I chose to quote her. So let me just read a little bit from the book. Page 57 sort of sums up. I wrote this myself, so hopefully it makes sense to you and gives you the main points. The legacy left by King Alfred the Great was one of exemplary leadership. So great leadership skill, one. In times of war, he was brave, capable, and dedicated military commander. And in times of peace, he was a reasonable and responsible statesman. That's two, okay? There's two things. He was a good leader, military commander, and he was a good statesman. So politics. He was Christian. This is seen as a good point because it becomes a Christian kingdom. He was pious. Piety means very dedicated to his religion. His piety was self-evident, and although his merits have most likely been exaggerated over the centuries, his demerits minimized, his accomplishments and the tales of his model Christian behavior is more memorialized in the minds of the people and the evolution of British culture. His story was suppressed by the Normans because they're Norman, they're not Anglo-Saxon, but not that long ago, when Great Britain became Great Britain, 300 years ago about, the British, the Scottish, and there's a lot of great Scottish writers. They started writing histories, and he was sort of revived, and all of his good points were emphasized. He's also sometimes called the father of the Navy because he tried to make some ships to fight the Vikings, but it didn't really work. Sometimes Henry VIII is known as the father of the British Navy. Sometimes they give the credit to Alfred because he was the first guy who really made an attempt. Okay, Vikings Ho is the next part. So the Danelaw, it explains a little bit about Danish culture. On page 59, there's a sort of ruin up in the Hebrides on Orkney Island. One of the things on my bucket list is to go up there to see Skara Brae, this 5,000-year-old settlement, which is much older than this, but there's a whole bunch of remnants, ruins of Viking settlements too, all kinds of interesting stuff. This is actually supposedly a Viking church. So there were Vikings that actually converted to Christianity as well. Canute the Great, what happened was Alfred's line started dying out, and there weren't any capable princes to become kings, and so they sort of asked Canute, because the Danes were continuously attacking them and asking them for money, and the English people kept paying them because that by this point, this is 1000 AD about. By this point, when Canute's there, we're talking past 1000 AD. In the 11th century, it says 995 actually, when he was born. So right close to the millennial mark. His father was famous. His grandfather and his grandfather's grandfather. He was from a long line of Viking kings. He ended up taking control of most of the nations and kingdoms around the North Sea. So he was the king of Denmark and England, and he controlled Scotland and Ireland and Wales. Not Wales as much, but is sort of on the edge. But the whole British Isles were under his control. At the same time, he had Denmark and Sweden at the same time. So he had he was going back and forth, and he never had a good successor. his children fought with each other and were not popular leaders. So he ends up being the unifier of all of these people so far. But then he dies without leaving somebody behind, which is a problem that England will have over and over again. You'll see there's bad kings and good kings, and English have a lot of problems, keeping their line of kings going with good leaders. Alfred and Canute are probably more of exceptions than rules, that there's more bad kings and good kings over the history of England. But I didn't count exactly how many I consider really bad or really good, but there's some really bad ones. Some of them are too young. That's part of the problem. So Canute dies, his children are not eligible, so they bring Edward. He's actually sort of tangential. He's related through his mother to Alfred. And he's hanging out in Normandy and in France, and he comes back and he becomes the king. His problem is the same as many English kings. It'll mention about Edward the Confessor there. He's got some of the qualities of Alfred, but two major things Edward doesn't do. He doesn't have children. He gets married, and him and his wife just don't have kids. Nobody knows exactly, but they didn't seem to get along. But maybe it was a medical problem. Maybe it was a physical thing. Nobody really knows. But he did go to church a lot. So his nickname was Edward the Confessor. And later, they make him into a saint, right? He's Saint Edward. And that he gets turned into a saint about 160 years after his death. So he lives he lives from 1042. He reigns as king for about 25 years. And people weren't that happy with him at the time. One of his best qualities is he's a good Christian. He doesn't seem to be cheating on his wife. He's just not interested in her. That's one of the explanations. He's just not interested. He's more interested in church than his wife. So no kids. One of the effects of him, though, is as soon as he dies, who's going to become the king? One of the powerful families, the Godwins, Earl Godwinson, Earl Godwin has several sons called Godwinson. Harold Godwinson will become the king. We're not going to talk about him too much, so we'll just call him Harold, or Harry, if you like. But he's not going to last very long. He's going to take over, and he's going to be a pretty good military leader, but William's going to show up. That's in chapter 2, which we're not going to talk about until Friday. So we'll delay that discussion for later. But basically, Edward had a problem. He didn't have a prince. He wasn't as effective a military leader like Alfred. He just didn't control the army, and he wasn't really interested. He was mostly interested in church. He was intelligent, but he was not a warrior king. And that's a problem when there's a bunch of powerful people that control half your country. Earl Godwin and his sons he's an earl. And the earl it's almost like a junior king. So he has a big territory and he has his own army. And then his children end up having armies. And one of his kids ends up becoming friends with Vikings and attacks England with Vikings. So Edward has his hands full with these powerful nobles that are basically trying to be junior kings all the time and trying to control him. So when he dies, naturally, one of those Earl Godwin's children, one of those powerful sons, takes over the kingdom, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. But William is also related to Edward and Alfred through his, I don't know, it's complicated. It's like his great aunt. His great aunt, very, very far distant relationship. But he still says that he has a claim to the throne. So William decides to declare war on Harold, and then we'll talk about what happens, how William takes over England and how he changes the culture completely. But Edward and Harold, they will continue the line of Anglo-Saxon kings until Normandy invades and the Normans take over, and that's the Norman conquest, which that is chapter 2. So that will be, I'm going to talk about the Normans first. I still have to make another video, so we'll see how fast that gets, produced. But for now, any questions about this stuff, you can ask. Introduction, end of the introduction, and up to this point is what's the material for the mock quiz. That will be a week from Friday. So you have a week to digest this and to watch it and to study. And it's a mock quiz. It's a practice quiz. So you'll see how it goes and then adjust after that. That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you again soon.